Hi, everyone, and welcome to episode 305 of the Medieval Podcast. I'm your host, Danièle Cybulskie. On September 4th, 925, 1100 years to the day this episode is released, King Athelstan was crowned at Kingston-upon-Thames. Athelstan is most often talked about in the context of the famous Battle of Brunanburh, but maybe we should be talking about him in other terms. Maybe we should recognize him, as my guest this week does, as the first king of England. This week, I spoke with Dr. David Woodman about the life and legacy of Athelstan. David is professor of history at Robinson College, Cambridge, and the author of Edward the Confessor, the Sainted King, as well as being the co-editor of many other works, including Constructing History Across the Norman Conquest, Worcester circa 1050 to 1150, and Writing, Kingship and Power in Anglo-Saxon England. His new book is The First King of England, Athelstan and the Birth of a Kingdom. Our conversation on Athelstan's life, his rule, and his attempt to unite the kingdoms of Britain is coming up right after this. Well, thank you, David, for joining us to talk about Æthelstan, who is going to be more important than people have already imagined. I'm sure you're going to sell this to us because this is something you feel passionately about. So welcome.
Thank you very much for having me.
Okay, so when we're talking about this particular king, what period are we talking about? Can you situate us in time and place?
Yeah, of course. So we're talking about the early 10th century, broadly speaking. So we don't know precisely when, but we think that Athelstan was born in about the year 894, so right at the end of the 9th century, and he becomes king for the first time in the year 924. And he stays on the throne right the way through to his death in 939. So broadly speaking, from the late 9th century all the way through to the early 10th century, at a time when there's so much going on politically in England and Britain more generally.
Yes, there are so many kingdoms, and this is kind of a big part of the story that you're going to be talking about. So in the book, you start with Alfred the Great. Should we start there when we're talking about Athelstan's biography? Should we start there? Let's start there.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
So Alfred is Athelstan's grandfather, and Alfred the Great, he's probably the most famous medieval king, and famous, of course, for repelling the Viking attacks, ultimately being successful in winning over the kingdom against the onslaught of Vikings, which had been plaguing England and Britain from about the mid-860s in earnest onwards. So Alfred had a major job during his time as king. And so Athelstan, as he's born in the mid-890s, is arriving amid a scene of real difficulty domestically. A kingdom that is not only internally fragmented, and you mentioned there, Danièle, that the political makeup of England is very complex. So we have lots of independent kingdoms, places like Mercia in the Midlands, Wessex in the south and west, East Anglia in the east, and Northumbria in the north. But it's also, of course, having to cope with the Viking onslaught. And the Vikings have taken over various parts of eastern and northern England at this moment. So there's a settlement of Vikings that is taking place as well.
So when we talk about Alfred's kingdom, starting there, which kingdom is Alfred's?
Yeah, so Alfred had been king of the West Saxons initially. So he acceded in 871 as king of the West Saxons. And in the 880s, he seems to have joined together both Wessex and Mercia into one. And we get this reference to a new polity, a new kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons, so something that is broader than just Wessex itself. And it looks a bit like Alfred and his advisors have constructed this idea of a new kingdom in the face of the external Viking attack. They recognize that they desperately need to be joined together internally in order to be successful against this external threat. So Alfred, very, very interesting for bringing together this new vision of what the kingdom could be, basically.
Well, and it gets bigger from there. So when we're talking about Athelstan growing up, how much do you think he would have seen of Alfred's kingship? Do you think that would have had an impact on the way that he was envisioning kingship in the future?
Yeah, definitely. I think there would have been a large impact from his grandfather's reign in various respects, both militarily in ways that we will see. Alfred was also renowned for sponsoring an educational reform as part of his kingship, something that we also see Athelstan placing a large emphasis on. So those are definite influences that we can see coming through into the reign of Athelstan. One very interesting thing about Athelstan himself is that quite early on in his life, he's sent from the heart of the West Saxon court up into Mercia, where he's brought up actually by his aunt, who's a very interesting character in her own right, someone called Athelflad, who's the lady of the Mercians, and her husband Ethelred, who's the lord of the Mercians. And we think that he was probably sent away because his father, who was Edward the Elder, the son of Alfred the Great, married on 2 subsequent occasions after Athelstan's mother. So we think he was sent away at that point and raised in Mercia instead.
Well, earlier in the year, I spoke to Matthew Firth about early English queens, and we do talk about Athelflaed, and that's the right one, right?
It is the right one, yes. Yeah.
I was telling you earlier, I do 14th century, and I got to tell you, all those Ash names really confuse me. So we did talk about that and the fact that some of these queens and family dynamics can be pretty spicy at times. So we have Athelstan, he's being raised in Mercia. Do we have an idea of what sort of things he was learning at that time, like a broad sense, as much as we don't have his journals from that time?
Yeah, I wish we had his journals. That would be fantastic if we get that kind of insight. But what we do have, actually, remarkably, so one of the main contemporary narrative texts is a text called the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. And embedded within the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle are a set of annals, entries about Athelflaed. So we actually have quite a clear view of the kind of person that she was. And she was clearly an extraordinary leader. So she was somebody who, within Mercia, was trying to reclaim bits of the Midlands from Scandinavian possessions. So trying to win over different parts. She was very active militarily. She was involved with her husband and with her brother in constructing what we think are fortified strongholds, things called burhs, in strategic locations across the Midlands in a way to try and shore up that Midlands area. And I think this would have sent a very potent example to Athelstan, of the kind of leadership that was necessary in the face of these difficulties within the English kingdoms.
Right. And one more thing that I want to dig into about his early years, because he's away from court, and we know, looking at this early English, or no matter which kingdom we're looking at this time, when we're looking at that sort of kingship, that sort of court, knowing the people around you is very important. So how do you think this would have affected his knowledge of the goings on at home?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a really good question. And I think something that's very difficult for Athelstan to deal with, actually, when he first becomes king in 924. So he's, as the son of Edward the Elder, who'd been the previous king, and the grandson of Alfred, he's very much part of the West Saxon royal house. But having been brought up in Mercia, there's evidence that when he first becomes king, there's a bit of hostility to him, particularly from Winchester, so the old centre of the West Saxon kingdom. And we even read about a plot to have him blinded. So there's a historian who's working in the early 12th century, a man called William of Malmesbury, a monk at Malmesbury. He writes this very, very interesting history about English kings, but also about English bishops. And he recounts this tale that someone called Alfred had plotted to have Athelstan blinded and therefore neutralized politically. So yes, definitely a degree of hostility to his becoming king in the first place. And maybe even that rule was shared in 924 when he first comes to the throne. So he has a half-brother called Ælfweard, and there's a Winchester text which records the fact that Ælfweard was also king at this early stage. And frustratingly, this often happens with the early medieval period. We don't get much detail about what actually was going on. What does this mean in reality? But we think that there may have been a situation where Athelstan was king in Mercia and Ælfweard was king in Wessex.
I mean, this is the type of thing that you're working with, and probably why I stay very far away from this time period, because, you'd think it would be something that's very obvious. How many kings do we have at this time? But it's not very obvious, especially when we'll get into other kingdoms in a second. People have all the same names. So it can be confusing. But I mean, it's worth noting that sharing kingship is not all that weird at this moment either. So it's very possible it could have happened.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess the good news for Athelstan was that Ælfweard only lived for a few more weeks. So he dies very soon afterwards. And then Athelstan does indeed become the sole king of the Anglo-Saxons at that point. Okay,
so when Athelstan comes to the throne, we've left his grandfather Alfred behind. What sort of kingdom does he get from his father?
So 924, he accedes probably jointly with his half-brothers we mentioned, and then he becomes sole king. And at that moment, we think that he's king both of Wessex and of Mercia. So what had been the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons under Edward the Elder and first under Alfred. And from that moment, from 924, a few years later in 97, he creates England for the first time. So it's a very quick increase in the extent of his authority, the bounds of his kingdom. So it's a very rapid rise, if you like, Athelstan, that it was really problematic coming to the throne in the first place. He had to fight for his position. And then only a few years later, he's creating England for the first time in 927.
Yes, well, this is kind of the crux of our story. And I think the reason why you really want to write a book about this guy and talk about this guy. So let's talk about 927. When you talk about creating England, what do you mean here? Because this is a massive, massive event.
Yeah, it's a huge event. I have to say, having grown up through the UK schooling system myself, I'm amazed that until I was an undergraduate student, I really didn't know about this date and the importance of this date in particular. When Athelstan first becomes king in 94, as I said, he's king of the Anglo-Saxons, king of Wessex and Mercia. At the same time that he's king of that area, there's a Viking ruler who's in charge in York and in the southern part of Northumbria, a man called Sitrick. And he seems to have been a very powerful leader, and he's one of a succession of Viking kings who's ruled in York up until that moment. And Athelstan is, he's clearly very aware of the difficulties of dealing with these Viking settlers in and around York. One of the things that he does try and get them on side is that he marries his full sister, whose name that we don't know. He marries her to Sitrick to try and sort of agree, an alliance between the two kingdoms. Now, what happens in 97 is that Sitrick dies, and Athelstan gets word of his death and very quickly moves on York and Northumbria. He marches north from William of Malmesbury again. We have an account where he razes the fortress, the Viking fortress at York, to the ground, takes it under his control. And then he marches further north and he goes to a place called Eamont Bridge, which is a mile south of modern Penrith in the northwest. And there's an extraordinary ceremony that takes place at which various different other British kings, so 2 kings from Welsh territories, 1 from Scottish territory, and a Northumbrian ruler, and we think a ruler from the northwest kingdom of Strathclyde and Cumbria, they all agree to recognise the superiority of Athelstan that day. And from 927, he is sort of rebranded, if you like. There's a sort of PR spin that goes on. And he's now the Rex Anglorum in Latin. He's the king of the English. And it's the first time that we have this sort of genuine usage of that term. So it's an extraordinary moment when this happens in 927. There was even a poet with him in the entourage that day in July in 97. And he commissions this poet to write a poem celebrating what's happened. And he writes these verses, which he sends to Winchester to announce that England has just been made whole. Ista perfecta Saxonia in Latin, that England has been made whole. So an extraordinary moment in history.
I have so many questions about this moment. First of all, terminology is important when we're talking about this period. So this is the first time that we're talking about the English as being the English and not Anglo-Saxon. Do I have that right?
Yeah, so there have been discussions before Athelstan's reign about a single English people. What would it mean to be a single English people? And in fact, those discussions go all the way back to the early 8th century with Bede. It was an idea that probably came from Rome ultimately and is being discussed in early Northumbria. And it was really revived at the court of King Alfred the Great, so Athelstan's grandfather again, just at the moment that he's creating that wider polity of the kingdom of the Anglo-Saxons. He's also discussing, what do we share in common? What common sense of identity do we have? And they look to this Germanic identity of being the English people. And we get this reference in Old English to the Ongelkun, so again, the English for the first time in Alfred's reign. So it's not so much that's the first discussion of that. It's the first time that, Athelstan is the first one to bring it into a political reality, if you see what I mean. He's created an England of a geographical and political shape that is one that's recognizable today for the first time.
Well, thank you for spelling that out, because there is discussion about this, continues to be discussion about this. I'm sure you're familiar with it. So I wanted to make sure that we were on the same page here. And okay, so the thing that really gets me about 927 is the geography. So this is a huge island. The geography of Scotland's very different from that of Wales. What would make you want to unite all of these kingdoms and try to control them all at once, considering the amount of manpower that you have? What was the ambition here? Why do you think that they wanted, that Athelstan himself or the people around him wanted to unite?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think there are probably multiple answers to it. I think one thing very plainly is it's got to be driven by ambition and power and status on Athelstan's part. That's what he wants. He wants to be recognized as a king that's, I guess, exceeded what his father and grandfather had achieved. So certainly that's part of it. There's definitely a wealth aspect. Of course, the more land that a king owns, the more access to wealth that they have, and therefore also, I guess, the greater security in their followers. The way in which early medieval kings worked is that they dispensed treasure to their followers, to their supporters, to make sure that they had them on side. And of course, by expanding territory, that gave them greater access to resources. So I think that's definitely part of it. So power and status and wealth, I think, are high up the agenda for why they did that. I think also, if we think about early England, we've already sort of given a good sense of the political complexities of the place. It had been this sequence of independent kingdoms interspersed with Viking settlement of various kinds, and the constant threat of overseas invasion from Scandinavia and from other places. Then again, I guess there was a real logic in trying to bring everyone together within England and within the English kingdom if they were threatened in the future by overseas attack. So I think it's probably a combination of all of those things.
Right. An alliance, but I'm at the top, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
Well, I think that when you're looking at this time period, there's always the specter of Charlemagne as well. Yeah. And I think this is in the minds of the people who are living at this moment, and especially somebody who wants to unite things. So when we're talking about like this massive geographical area like Charlemagne was dealing with, do you get a sense that Athelstan is trying to centralize and trying to make this work administratively the way that Charlemagne was?
Yeah, that's a really important point. I think you're absolutely right about that. I mean, we see lots of innovations in governance by Æthelstan. I mean, one of the reasons I find his reign so interesting is exactly that. That, after 927, for the first time, we have unequivocal evidence of the existence of a sort of royal scriptorium, a degree of centralized oversight of the production of royal documents. So the king is charging a royal scribe who we call Æthelstan A. It's an anonymous title because we don't know exactly who he was, but charging this person with the production of royal diplomas for the king. So definite centralized production there. And what these diplomas show, very startlingly, is these extraordinary political gatherings. So at the end of the royal diplomas, which are grants of land, basically speaking, we have lists of witnesses of all of the people who were present at the meeting of the King's Assembly. There are people drawn from Northumbria, from Wessex, from Mercia, from different places, even from Welsh and Scottish territory. So mimicking the large political gatherings that Charlemagne had encouraged as well. And similarly, Athelstan we're very fortunate for Athelstan's reign that we have a whole sequence of law codes that he issued, which have happened to survive. So he's a king who's keen to legislate, again, in the same way that Charlemagne had been. So I think that's a very important exemplar to bring up. And in fact, another very interesting aspect of Athelstan's reign is that he's trying to create very close links with contemporary Europe at the same time. So he's a king who has a sort of concerted foreign policy in a way that we've not seen before as well.
Yes, and we might get into that in a second. Before we leave 927 behind, I want to ask one more question, and that is, how do you think this was accomplished? Because in the brief discussions of kings that you might get in history books where they're like, here's how you can tell the kings apart, there is always this flavor that Athelstan has done this in a way that is perhaps pretty nasty. Like, I always get this sort of impression that he is thought to be a king that was ruthless. And maybe because of the fact that he united these kingdoms together, and maybe that's the only way we can conceive of this happening. How do you think it happened?
Well, I think there's definitely a degree of ruthlessness. He's certainly a martial king. We see him going to war at various points. But I think what we should remember is that, that was very typical of the early medieval period. To be a successful king, you had to be martially successful as well. So definitely a king who's a warring king. But he also tries to cement his authority over these places with governmental reforms, the kind of things that we've been talking about. This idea of there being a royal scriptorium, he takes this into Northumbria. He's the first of the West Saxon kings that we find able to grant land via the mechanism of royal diplomas in the north. We see that happening for the first time. And he legislates also that there should be one system of coinage throughout the entirety of the English kingdom. Now, from the evidence of the coins that have survived, he doesn't quite get there, but he's at least trying to do that. So we see a king who's got a view for the way these administrative structures could work across the English kingdom. So certainly it's achieved by military effort in the first place, but it's then tried to be secured by these administrative means as well.
I mean, it's the best of both worlds. As much as we can grasp from this distance, and as much as I think when we understand kingship, they may not be people that we want to make friends with, but we can admire or at least understand the way that they're achieving what they are achieving.
I think that's a really good point, because we shouldn't think that it's just created overnight and that's it, if you see what I mean. People would have received this message of the Kingdom of the English very differently depending on where they lived. If they were in the north, it would have been a very different message from if they were in the far southwest, for example. So yeah, I mean, it was a very complex picture.
Yes. And one of the things I found most fascinating in your book, something you've just brought up, is his law codes, because the law codes are not created and then static. As you say, there's a series of them that show the thinking behind the changes in laws and what can we actually accomplish? What should we accomplish? So can we talk about the law codes for a moment? What do you see in the early ones? What do you see changing?
I think the thing about the law codes that I find really impressive is that we see a system of governance that is quite dependent on the written word in a way that you might not expect for such an early period. So he issues law codes across his reign. And you see one issue in particular that keeps cropping up is that of theft. Theft is clearly a problem in the early 10th century. And Athelstan issues laws about it. He's got a major set of laws that he issues at a place called Greatley, and he tries to get rid of theft. And some of the injunctions, particularly, of course, to our modern mind, are absolutely brutal. Anybody over the age of 12 who's caught stealing anything of substance is automatically killed. And what we see is these law codes are sent out to different parts of the kingdom, and people who are responsible for enacting the law codes, people like bishops or royal officials like ealdormen or reeves, they're trying to implement the laws, seeing how it goes, and then they're sending reports back to Athelstan. So we get the reports back to Athelstan as well. So that's what's extraordinary, I think, about Athelstan's reign, that you get the sort of issuing from the centre, but then also you get the sort of reciprocal reports coming back from the different kingdoms to show, what's the reality of this. And as a result of those reports back, Athelstan changes various, injunctions. For example, about thieves, he becomes a bit less severe in his judgment in various subsequent law codes, but then reverts again later in his reign when it's still not working. So it's that toing and froing and that dependence on written communication across the kingdom, which I find fascinating.
Yes. And considering he only ruled for about 15 years, there've got to be people who are like, okay, what is the law right now about this?
Exactly.
I can't remember what the last amendment to this law was. Do we hang this person or not? I mean, I'm making a joke about it, but it is true where sometimes there's a lag in documentation and you have to really think about this. But Athelstan, I do think that the laws around theft are really interesting as well, because we know from historical records that people are not automatically killed. A lot of people get off, they're fined, whatever. But he does seem to care about this to the point where he's like, I don't like the idea of 12-year-olds being killed over this. Yeah. Maybe we should raise this to 15.
Yeah, exactly.
So it must be happening somewhere in that he's getting these reports back. And it's interesting for somebody who may have the flavor of ruthlessness about him around his biography that he's like, no, I'm not okay with killing children. I think this is actually really a big insight into this person's character, as much as we can have one.
Yeah, exactly right. Yeah, no, I think that's a very good observation. And law codes, some of them are written in the first person singular. So sometimes you really do, the extent to which this is true, I'm not sure. But sometimes you do get a feeling of being, proximity to the discussions that were taking place at the Royal Assembly when they would have been talking about these things. How should we legislate? How should we deal with these matters? Certainly, it's at the centre of governance and what was happening.
Right. Okay, so he's doing his best to be the king that he wants to be, whether we are into that or not. Some people are definitely not into that because things start to fragment a little bit and he has to go off to war up north. So what happens within a few years of this United Kingdom?
Well, I guess one of the results of being a king who's sort of expanding like this and trying to acquire territory in novel ways is of course that you'll create resentment and enmity against you. And that's definitely what happened with Athelstan. And he's beset by various different threats to his position at various different points in his reign. In 934, he marches north. He stops at various places on the way. We know he goes to Nottingham, then he goes to Chestley Street. And he seems to have been trying to win over the favour of big local institutions, big churches. So the York Church and at Chestley Street, St. Cuthbert's community. And he goes further north in 934 into Scotland, where he wages a campaign of war. And that seems to have been, again, we don't have very many records about what actually happened, but in the very next year, we find the Scottish king is summoned to Athelstan's court. In those royal diplomas, his name crops up. So clearly there's been a sort of degree of success on Athelstan's part following that expedition. But this all comes to a head in the famous occasion in 937 at the Battle of Brunanburh, where a major coalition that comprised Olaf Guthfrusson, who was a Viking from Dublin, and Constantine, who was the king of the Scots, and Owen, who was king of the Strathclyde and Cumbrians, joined forces and threatened Athelstan, tried to topple him, basically. We know quite a lot about this battle because of a remarkable poem that's inserted into the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle for the year 937, which records it and its outcome.
Well, I mean, let's talk about this, because if people have heard of Athelstan, it's maybe not for uniting England. It's probably for this battle. So what do we actually know about this battle? Because even though we know more perhaps than about other things, we still don't know a lot about it.
Yeah, there's much that's still debated about it. I guess one thing to say is that it was certainly a momentous occasion. As we said earlier, war was endemic. Battles were very common in the early medieval period. But that this was a special occasion is clear from the fact that many of the sources from Ireland, from Wales, from Scotland, from Scandinavia, they all record the battle and its outcome. So the fact that it's getting such wide coverage is an indication of just how significant it was. And the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, that major contemporary English text, is quite silent, unfortunately, in general for Athelstan's reign. So it's clearly a significant moment that in 937 it inserts this wonderful poem of, heroic poem of sort of 80 lines length or something like that. So a very significant occasion. Now, one of the big stumbling blocks that you're hinting at, Danièle, is exactly where it took place. And, there's been a huge amount of modern debate. I think something like 40 to 50 different possible locations have been suggested for where Brunanburh might be. I think it's broadly agreed that it must be in Northumbria. And the real debate is whether or not it's in the west, on the Irish Sea coast, or whether it's in the east somewhere. Now, my own money's on a place called Bromburgh on the Wirral in the west. That seems the most likely location for me. But yes, it's full of interest and intrigue, the poem.
Right. So what can we tell from the poem? Can we tell anything about the tactics, or we just know that in the end, Athelstan is victorious? What do we know about the battle itself?
The poem waxes lyrical about the success, the victory that Athelstan and his half-brother Edmund achieved that day, and talks about the fact that the Viking coalition was chased away and had to sort of escape to their boats and flee back across the Irish Sea. So that's pretty much the broad outline of this, and it exults in the slaughter that's taken place, the fact that there were bodies littering the ground, which were eaten by scavenger birds. It seemed to delight in the kind of gory detail. It's just exulting in the victory of Athelstan and his half brother.
And this is one, I think they say in this account that Athelstan's forces chase everybody down for like an entire day, just killing them, just chasing them. I mean, this is not unusual for a battle, but you don't usually see like for the entire day they were pursued. Yes. Yeah, so it is definitely something that would have been memorable to the people who were there. They would have brought reports back. It would have been something that really would have made an impression, especially because, again, when we're thinking about distances, like this is a long way from Wessex to go up to fight people who are more local to the place, probably, if we can figure out where the place is.
Yeah, and I think, if we're thinking about the kind of reaction that Athelstan would have received for the fact that he was so aggressive militarily and as a king, one text that really brings it home for me is a Welsh poem of about this, and it's a bit difficult to date, but I think it can be plausibly dated to Athelstan's reign. There's a Welsh text called Armus Prydain Fawr, the Great Prophecy of Britain, which calls in really bloodthirsty terms for the Welsh and the Britons to rise up and slaughter the English and drive them from the island. So if we're thinking about the way in which his rule has certainly been received in these British territories, that gives a good flavour of the way that they at least experienced English kingship.
Yeah, which is not particularly nice. But in the end, Athelstan still is victorious here, and he lives for another couple of years. How does he end up dying in the end? Is this one of those Game of Thrones moments? What happens?
I'm afraid we don't know exactly how Athelstan dies. There's a sort of laconic entry in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle recording his death. One thing that's very interesting is that having died, he's taken to Malmesbury Abbey, where he's buried. And in fact, if you go to Malmesbury today, there's a beautiful late 14th, early 15th century tomb of Athelstan in the wonderful abbey there. And one of the reasons that's very interesting is that his father and grandfather, so Edward and Alfred, had been buried in the New Minster in Winchester. So it seems to be sending some kind of message that Athelstan is doing things differently. Did he still consider himself an outsider, at this point, the fact that he'd been brought up in Mercia? Or was he sending a message that, he was a king not just of Wessex, but of a larger area too? These are good questions, but there was clearly something pointed in the place that he chose to be buried.
Well, and this is interesting too, because if he's being buried somewhere which is not where his ancestors traditionally being buried, does this mean that he had some time to figure this out? Like, does this mean he maybe wasn't assassinated because he had some time to say, here's where I want to be buried? Or maybe he thought of it earlier. These are the questions that I'm always interested in. We will just never know.
Two of his relatives had died in the Battle of Brunanburh, and there's an indication in the pages of William of Malmesbury that Athelstan had been involved in saying that they should be buried at Malmesbury, just as he wished. So he clearly had some kind of input into the choice of burial site. I think we can say that much.
I mean, you do want to think about this before you go into battle. You got to cover all the bases, right? Here's what I want to happen. So when he does die, he actually has left behind no heirs. And this is really interesting. Can you tell us why there are no heirs?
Yeah, well, a very notable feature of Athelstan's reign is that he himself never married. There's no record of him marrying, and there's only one allusion to the fact that he may have had a daughter, but it's written in a 12th century text that we think just got it wrong. Was trying to refer to his sister, and it was actually a mistaken reference to a sister rather than a daughter. So had no children to whom he could bequeath the throne. And it's possible that because his father had married 3 times in total and had left a number of sons and a number of daughters, that actually there were already a number of what we call athelings, an Old English term which broadly means princes, who were, eligible for the throne in their own right. And one feasible suggestion here is that Athelstan was aware of that and simply didn't want to complicate matters further, and therefore didn't leave any heirs of his own.
Well, this is interesting because when I was speaking with Matthew Firth about this, and I think I've got the right king and the right heirs to the throne. When I said he left no heirs of his body, but he did decide who was going to take over next. And these are his half-brothers, right? His younger half-brothers, who he decides not to kill off. This is really interesting to me. He allows them to be raised well away from the court, and then he allows them to come back to court, and he sort of raised them, prepares them for this. This is kind of unusual in that if he had had an heir of his body, maybe that would have solved some of the other atheling problems. So this is still really interesting to me. What do you think about this whole, his half-brothers?
I guess the interesting thing for me is that, so Edmund becomes king in 939, his half-brother, as you say, after his death. And one of the things that we see happening as well is, of course, that the English kingdom that he's created fragments. And that's a big development after Athelstan's death. It carries the implication, I guess, that the creation of the English kingdom in the first place had rested an awful lot on one person's shoulders here. It was Athelstan that was driving it forward, and it was him who held it together. I mean, for me, he was precociously powerful, if you see what I mean. He'd created something that was very much tied to him. And so in 939, as Edmund becomes king in Wessex and Mercia, what we see happening in York is that Olaf, the very person who threatened Athelstan in 937 at Brunanburh, he's able to come back and become king in York in his own right. And then it becomes a really complex political situation across the middle of the 10th century of toing and froing between different English kings and Viking kings, oscillations of fortune and jostling for power in various ways.
Well, I mean, we shouldn't have expected it to stay permanent. The same thing happened to Charlemagne as well. So, these things happen. But yeah, it is very interesting when you think about somebody who is thinking so carefully about administration, about unification. Even if you put in all the safeguards, it may not work out in the end. Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think as well, the way I like to think of it anyway is that he'd sort of set a blueprint for what could be done. And actually later in the 10th century, one of his successors, the king, Edgar the Peaceable, he sort of drives this forward in a new way and takes things to new heights. So sort of Edgar cements, I think, what Athelstan had shown was possible. Yes. Well, and I think that is valuable as well, because even if it doesn't continue on in the same way, it gives people a reference point, right? Where in those in-between years, you can think, were we better off when we were united, or are we better off now? And that is actually very valuable information, as much as that can be a very turbulent time when you're living through it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I do want to give you a chance to talk about documents, because this is one of the books where I've seen a person just rave over documents, maybe more than ever. So you really love the documents of this time. What is so amazing about them?
You're absolutely right. I love the diplomas that are produced in Athelstan's name. We talked a little bit about diplomas already, but just to sort of refresh, I mean, a diploma in its original form, it's broadly speaking a grant of land and various legal privileges from the king to an institution or to an individual. And I think what I love about Athelstan's documents is that his diplomas rather, is that they take on completely new form in his reign. So they're unprecedented in their literary guise, basically. They're documents that are longer than any diplomas we've ever seen before. In fact, so long are they that if you go to look at them in their original form in the British Library, you're sent to a separate desk because they're so large to look at them. So they're sending a sort of visual statement. We think these things were composed and read at the meeting of the Royal Assembly. So they were sending a statement of power and written in phenomenally learned Latin. And, you know, these are governmental administrative documents which are designed to do the nitty gritty of granting land. But actually, they take so much care in the way that they're written, in the Latin that they use. They have allusions to 7th century authors, people like Aldhelm of Malmesbury. And the Latin is very learned. As I said, it alliterates, it rhymes, it has all sorts of literary devices like hyperbaton and chiasmus. So basically, he's showing off. He and his royal scribe, they're showing off the political successes, the political advances that Athelstan has made. So it's a way of, in the context of the Royal Assembly, trying to demonstrate exactly what Athelstan has achieved as a king. So yes, I do. I'm afraid I do really enjoy looking at those diplomas. And I think they send such strong messages about political authority and performativity at the royal court.
Yes. Well, I hope you're not embarrassed by this, because this is amazing. I love it when people are really into something, because what you're seeing here is not just an amazing document, but as you say, the implications are massive. And we're talking about Athelstan A, the scribe, right now, right? So how much do you think this comes from the man himself, the king himself? Because you do say that some of the diplomas change. So this is kind of a feature of Athelstan A. And we have talked a little bit about the king himself being educated. So how much of this do you think might come from the top?
I think it is coming from the top. I think, as you say, Danielle, Athelstan is a king who places a special emphasis on learning. His court was a hub of scholarship in various ways. He was encouraging scholars from across Europe to come and to take part in discussions and exchange texts and ideas. It's actually a place where we think there was one of the earliest interactions in England with the game of chess from India. That gives you an indication of the kind of place that it was. So he's certainly encouraging learning. And it's just in that atmosphere that you can imagine these kind of literary innovations taking place in everyday legal documents, the royal diplomas that he's creating. And within the body of some of the royal diplomas, we have some stipulations that the people receiving the land should be very careful in the prayers that they say for the king and his family. And that kind of personal reference, I think is very likely to have come from Athelstan himself. You know, I'll give you this land, but you have to do this as a result. So yes, I think he's driving it. And I think another aspect of this is also, again, that idea of the extent to which governance relied on the written word, which is so interesting. These are also bilingual documents. So again, if we're thinking about the way that they actually were used by those in the early 10th century, they're mostly in Latin. They set out the sort of T's and C's, the terms and conditions of the grant in Latin. And then when it gets to the bit of land that's being granted, they give the outer bounds of this in Old English, so in the vernacular. And these Old English boundary clauses are very wonderful for telling us about the early English landscape. You know, they say, take a right at the pond, go down to the big apple tree, and so on and so forth. So you get these wonderful incidental references about the early English landscape. But again, showing us the way in which they must have been used. You know, probably it was a local royal official who was responsible for drawing up the bounds, bringing it to the meeting of the Royal Assembly when they were inserted into this diploma. So yes, it's for all of these reasons that I really sort of get so enwrapped in his diplomas.
Well, this is a huge thing that you're pointing to as well, where you have Old English terminology for where the boundary lines are, because all of these things would have been read out loud. Some of the people would have understood the Latin. Most of the people, maybe not. And when we're talking about things like terminology, when we're saying that pond it's very important to put that in the words of the people who actually would be living near that pond. Because if you call it something else in Latin, people are like, wait, can we call it this perhaps? So this, I mean, there's a reason why you're enthusiastic about this stuff. It is
absolutely
super informational in ways that are rare for this period. And the fact that these documents exist is rare as well.
Yeah, I mean, quite amazingly, people are hard at work trying to recreate these bounds. Looking at the original Old English boundary clauses, going into the landscape today, trying to see where the boundaries would have occurred. Quite often, they are coterminous with parish boundaries, later parish boundaries, and in fact, some of the key features, like a big stone or a big tree, are still in the landscape today. So it becomes, this very exhilarating experience of being able to recreate these early 10th century boundary clauses in the modern landscape. It's extraordinary.
Well, I think that's very important work as well, because then you get a good sense of what is fair and how big it should be and what sort of aspects of the landscape would be brought into consideration. For example, if you're a farming community, it's not fair for some people to get something and other people to get other things. There's probably compensation involved, all of that stuff.
Yes, and I think, what you're alluding to there is a whole process in the background of how these things worked in reality. And you were talking about it being read out, which is dead right. Perhaps also they beat the bounds. Maybe they walked around the bounds. Maybe local officials took people around and showed people where these things were, these markers in the landscape. So yes, we get one document today, but behind that are so many layers of administration and process that you can understand.
Yes. So I hope that you've converted other people into loving these documents as well. Or just looking closely to the documents that survive, because there are so many other things that can be pulled from them. But as we come to the end of our time, you mentioned right at the end of your book, as so many people who do biography should say, I think you should say this if you're writing a biography, and that is, we should know this person. We should be talking about them. We should be thinking about them more often. So this is your moment. Why do you think all people should know about Athelstan?
Well, for me, it's all about 927 and its creation of England in the first place. It's woefully little known. I mean, it's a date that should be as important to my mind as 1066. And there are two big anniversaries coming up. One is the 1100th anniversary of his coronation in 925 on the 4th of September, so in a short amount of time. The other is, of course, in July 2027 will be the 1100th anniversary of the creation of England in the first place. So I hope as these big anniversaries come up on the horizon that the reign of Athelstan and his achievements in 97 will be better known.
Well, this is the opportunity. Everyone who listens to the Medieval podcast has been forever changed by you in this episode, right? I'm sure that's how it works. Well, thank you so much, David, for coming on and telling us all about Athelstan. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
To find out more about David's work, you can visit his website at dwoodman.co.uk. His new book is The First King of England, Athelstan and the Birth of a Kingdom. Before we go, here's Peter from medievalist.net to tell us what's on the website. What's going on, Peter?
Hey, so the Shroud of Turin is again in the news.
Whoa, what's going on?
This is a perpetual news item for us, but there is some new scholarship. Apparently, a 14th century scholar named Nicholas Oresme wrote about the shroud between 1370 and 1382, several years before the official investigation of the shroud was done.
Mm-hmm.
So he called it an example of clergymen doing fake miracles to get people to make donations.
Ooh, that's always controversial.
Indeed, indeed. It's interesting to kind of note how even way back then, lots of doubts were raised about the Shroud of Turin.
Yeah, I like that in that you can see the way that people investigated things like this. And that really shows the mental processes that people went through when they were trying to see if something was a true relic or not.
It's something that's still happening today, apparently, with this relic, as there's lots and lots of online debate, as I discovered.
You just discovered? I was going to say this is going to be a controversial article for you.
Well, maybe I knew about it before, but I didn't know there was a whole study devoted to it called Syndology.
There you go.
So we have that piece, plus we have a fun article from Laura Chevalier on what was a good and a bad tree in the Middle Ages.
This sounds like the beginning of a joke. What's the difference between a good tree and a bad tree?
There was lots of beliefs about, was it good for healing? Did it cause problems? Did you want to have it in your yard or not? For instance, a good tree was apparently the linden or lime tree, as it was known.
Nice.
It was admired for its sweet fragrance.
Yeah, that's immediately what I was thinking. It would smell amazing.
Apparently, it drew in bees and kind of gave it a musical quality. It was frequently planted near hospitals or leper houses as a healing tree.
That sounds amazing. You're making me want to get one for my house.
Indeed, indeed. I think we all should have a lime tree.
Sounds good.
Now, if there's a tree you don't want, it's a walnut tree.
Oh, why don't I want a walnut tree? I don't love walnuts, so you don't have to take much to convince me, but why don't I want one?
A lot of medieval beliefs that its roots would poison the soil and even make your cattle sick if they left their barn and went underneath its branches.
Whoa. I mean, I have a lot of cattle in my backyard, so I need to watch out for this, right?
Yeah, but even its leaves, it would make its leaves fall and injure other trees.
Whoa.
So this was a very bad tree.
I had no idea.
But of course, people still wanted walnuts.
So you have to weigh it all in the balance.
Indeed, indeed. So if you were a medieval walnut gatherer, it wasn't a risk-free life.
There you go.
So we have that piece. Plus, we also have 40 cities that had different names in the Middle Ages.
There were a lot, and you have a list. Is it top 40 or just 40 that we love?
It was the 40 I could find. I tried to get 50, but once I got to 40, I said, that's good enough. So.
Okay, so for all the people that are trying to figure out where the heck they are, this is the guide for you.
Indeed, indeed. So it is a nice guide. It takes you from Croatia to Japan.
Nice. Well, thanks, Peter, for stopping by and telling us where we are and what's on the website.
Thanks.
This week, we find out what happens to Charles VI on the finale of my mini-series, This is History Presents The Glass King. It's been a wild ride through 40 of the most tumultuous years of French history, and I hope that you've enjoyed it so far. Now it's time to find out how the last days of King Charles shaped the fragile future of France itself. You can catch all the action over on This is History. And there's just over a week left before my class is in session online. My Introduction to the 14th Century course starts September 12th, and it runs each week for 5 weeks. I wanted to make this a course where you get what you want out of it, so each week I'll speak for an hour and then answer all your burning questions about this period for another half hour. If you're on the fence, think fast because right now the back to school sale is still on where you can get 15% off any of the courses offered with the coupon code BACKTOSCHOOL, all one word. You can find it all at medievalstudies.thinkific.com. I hope to see you there. And finally, a big thank you as always to all of you for supporting my work by listening, sharing, letting the ads play through, or becoming patrons on patreon.com. Patrons are the wind beneath my wings because without you, none of this would be possible. So thank you. To find out more or to become a patron, please visit patreon.com/medievalists. For everything from kings to flings, follow medievalists.net on Instagram at medievalistnet or Blue Sky at medievalists. You can find me, Danièle Cybulskie, across social media at 5MIN Medievalist or 5 Minute Medievalist. And you can find my books at all your favorite bookstores. Our music is by Christian Overton. Thanks for listening and have yourself a fantastic day.